Hello friends, my name is Phil and this is PG Prototypes. No long intro today as I'm going to get back to work where I left off in last week's video. Thank you to everyone that watched last week's video and a special thank you to all of you that commented. I always appreciate those comments. It's the best part of the videos for me. I'm going to get stuck right into the main area that was commented on, which is the coal loading station at one of the McGilvery sidings. I start off by airbrushing Vallejo grey black onto the scene to simulate soot. I then brushed the same paint color onto the paving to simulate tire tracks from the front end loader. This is my first attempt at something like this, so I'm just giving it my best shot. It's not perfect, but I think it does the job. A funny anecdote for you today. In 2016, I actually drew plans for an existing charcoal manufacturing factory, and it took me a few days to measure it up. On the first day, I went dressed in my regular office best attire, not knowing what I was actually in for. And I went home covered in charcoal dust, my clothes completely black. I felt like my tissues could have been used to fuel fires. There was so much coal dust on them after blowing my nose. So I really feel for anyone that has to work in this type of environment on a daily basis. Next, I add some olive drab to the mix just for a bit of a highlight on these tire tracks. As usual, I'm using a layering technique to build up an overall color that I'm happy with. When I add too much paint, I just use my finger to dab it down and blend the colors together. The black paint is a bit tricky to see on the ballast, so the olive drab highlights really work well on this section. The coal bin needs to be blended into the rest of the scene, so I'm adding a generous layer of clear drying PVA glue to the surround of the coal bin. Next, I sprinkle the ballast mix I used on the rest of the layout over the wet glue. I also added a bit of this mix to the tire tracks from the previous step, and this just adds a little bit of texture to the scene. After leaving everything to dry until the glue was transparent, I applied a black wash to all the new texture, and this wash just helps blend everything together. This empty patch of grass caught my eye whilst I was busy with this part of the layout, so I decided to add 2 workers taking a little break here. Something I've noticed about factory yards on my travels is that there seems to be at least one forgotten pile of junk at every factory yard. I used my ballast blend mixed with watered down PVA glue to create a mud-like paste as my base layer. I added pallets, a barrel and some sacks to it to create my junk pile, and I'm going to blend this mixture into all the gaps so it looks like it's been there for a while. While I wait for the mud mix to dry, I'm going to detail the platform behind it. Nothing fancy here, just some details from my bits box. The junk pile has set, so I can start adding some paint to detail it. I'm using a grey blue wash as well as an olive drab wash to blend the junk pile into the surrounding scenery. You can see that I'm applying the wash to all the parts of the junk pile. When the wash dries, it will be a little bit lighter, leaving some of the underlying colors to show through. I want to add some greenery to the pile to create the impression that it's been there for a while. So I'm simply painting on some PVA glue and applying a sprinkle of Woodland Scenic's Fine Turf Summer Blend. To cap it all off, I thicken the foliage up with some Woodland Scenic's Lichen. I am really doing my best to use what I already have available. So although this Airfix Bedford truck is a bit old for this layout, I still figured I could make use of it. And I want the truck to look like it's been left under a tarp for some brave soul to come and rescue one day. Before I start adding the tarp, I'm going to close up the hole on the cab roof with a small piece of card, just so the tarp doesn't collapse into it at a later stage. A few months ago, my son actually broke the front wheel off this truck, And although I was really irritated at the time, this has now provided the perfect opportunity to add some character to the scene. So I added a small piece of 3mm MDF that I got out of my laser cutter scrap bin to simulate a block that the truck has been propped up on. There are many ways to create realistic tops, but my favorite by far is to just use some toilet paper and watered down PVA wood glue. I start off by wrapping the toilet paper around the truck in a rough position of how I would like it to look at the end. The toilet paper breaks very easily, so one has to use a bit of a gentle touch with this application. I'm using a soft bristled brush for this exercise, and I start by securing the easiest side in place first, and that is the flat part in the back of the truck. I then proceed to dab my glue mixture in place, maneuvering the toilet paper into all the nooks and crannies on the truck. The great thing about this method is that one can manipulate the toilet paper to create realistic gathers and folds. Another great thing about this method is that if you do encounter tears or parts that aren't exactly the way you want them to look, you can just build it up in layers with new pieces of toilet paper. I left the tarp to dry completely before I tackled the painting. Now, I also like adding small pops of color to scenes where possible, so I started by painting the wheel block red. Over the years, I have come to rely on washes so much more than any other paint technique, and the reason is that they are really great at automatically darkening recesses and leaving raised sections light, and you'll see how well it works on something like this tarp. I am placing the truck next to the office building at McGilvery Engineering. In reality, I love things like this because there's always a story behind them. These projects often start off as hand-me-downs or good deals purchased on a whim and ultimately become lessons in time management, patience, and at times cutting losses. You will know from my previous videos that I really enjoy having small stories on my layout. These two figures gave me a good chuckle as they reminded me of my brother and myself in our younger years. We were always working on projects to build cool things. I did the hard labor and my brother was the ideas guy. When I was 14 years old, my brother was 16, about 16 at the time. We really wanted to build a go-kart. We had no money, but we were confident that we could make a plan. My brother convinced me it would be a good idea to remove the motor from my dad's beloved lawnmower. He used to call it his Rolls Royce. It was a Briggs & Stratton roller mower and it cost a fortune on this side of the world. My parents had been divorced for many years and my dad had never come to get his mower, so where was the harm, right? We landed up absolutely destroying the mower, and we actually just got stuck trying to figure out how we could make a completely unnecessary turbo for it, and then lost interest in the project, leaving the remnants under a tarp in the garage. Fast forward to me being 18 and my dad came to get his mower back. All I can say is that that was the closest my dad ever came to giving me an absolutely monumental beatdown. He actually spoke about his great mower betrayal until the day he passed on. I felt that the first junk pile was successful enough, so I decided to add another one to an empty corner of the factory complex. I used the same method as before, but this time I added a lot more scrap to fill the scene. Over the past few months, I've visited a few factories and warehouses around town for work, and I've tried to be extra observant of the details that one might be able to add to a layout. There are tons of details one can add, but I often find it really tricky to decide what would fit the scene best. I'm doing my best on this layout, but I often find that it's a bit on the empty side. This is definitely a dynamic layout, so there is room for addition at a later stage, but for now I'm going to try and get it as close to done as possible by year end. While I waited for the junk heap to dry, I noticed something that was bugging me on the scene was the transition of the ramp to ground level. I had an old wood level crossing I had made for my American layout, so I decided to cut it up and use it here. I used the same method as before to paint and detailed the now dry junk heap. These heaps are such an easy addition to a layout. They are super cheap, and I feel they pay huge dividends in scenic value. As I mentioned before, this is all just scrap out of my laser cutter, but one could easily create the same effect with pieces of cut up card and some workshop waste. There are so many amazing scenery details available nowadays, but sometimes the cost means that they aren't viable for all of us. I truly believe that there are loads of methods that can be used to create good results on a budget. Another detail that had been bugging me was the gap at the edge of this factory complex. I had mixed up a big batch of ballast plaster mix for the junk heap, so I decided to fill all these gaps with it. And then when it was dry, I simply painted over it with a blue-gray wash. As I mentioned before, I feel that the layout is still looking a bit bare, so I decided to add some details to fill up some of the spaces. I'm a big fan of roof signage, so I built up a weathered McGilvery sign for the warehouse roof. I also wanted to fill this open space next to the warehouse building, so I made a workbench for this purpose. Let's take a look at how the layout is developing so far. I'm definitely a lot happier with the space so far, and the weathering of the coal dock has gone a long way in adding realism to the layout. Having more figures on the layout has also added a lot of movement and life to the layout. I also feel that having many mini scenes adds a lot of visual interest to the layout. These are the types of thing that draw a viewer's eye to different parts of one's layout. I'm going to leave it here for today's video. In the next video, I'm going to push to complete the remaining scenery. There isn't a lot to go, but as I mentioned before, I'm always open to additions and alterations, so I'm just going to play it by ear. Two things I've been thinking about adding are a lighting valance over the top of the layout and a backdrop. With the shuffling around of my workshop and the removal of my shelf layout, a perfect spot has opened up in the corner of my workshop for a permanent home for this layout. If you've been watching since the beginning, you will know that my original idea was to bring the layout into the house during the winter, but it actually proved to be rather pleasant in the workshop over this winter, so there isn't really a need to move it from the workshop to the house. If I do make these additions, it would mean that the rear of the layout won't be so visible, but I reckon this isn't a big deal at all. There's more than enough detail on the front to carry the layout through. And having experience with proper layout lighting on my previous harbour layout, I feel that the benefits would far outweigh any of the cons. As usual, I want to say a huge thank you to all of you that watch my videos, and I really appreciate the support. I'm doing my best to provide entertaining content, and all the feedback really helps keep me motivated. Now, although I'm well into the journey of posting my progress on this particular layout, I often just don't feel it's on par with some of the other insanely good content that is out there on social media platforms and on YouTube. I'm on many Facebook groups, and some of the work out there is just absolutely mind-blowing. I'll share some of my finds in future, but I just need to do a little bit of homework on what the rules are for sharing other people's content, so just bear with me on that. If you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing. It would really help my channel out. And until next time, keep on training.